One small brotherhood of free riders once redrew the map of Eastern Europe without their name printed on any border. In the 16th century, on windswept grasslands south of the forests, a few thousand men forged a republic of oaths and iron. Kings counted them, sultans cursed them, merchants insured against them. They called themselves Cossacks. No crown anointed them, no palace housed them, and yet their river-borne armies could set an empire trembling like a candle in a draught. If you live in Chicago or Seattle, in Philadelphia or Phoenix, their echo might be nearer than you think. A last name on your mailbox, a melody your grandmother hummed at the sink, a stubborn streak that refuses to bow. Threads carried across oceans and centuries. The steppe is far away, but its dust still clings to American shoes. Its stories crossed in trunks and steerage tickets, folded into Sunday dinners and old family photographs. Tonight, we follow that dust to the river called the Dnipro, where islands once rang with hammers and psalms, where men slept with saddles for pillows and woke to the hush before a raid. This is not a tale of castles and crowns alone. It is a tale of a people who made laws around a campfire, voted with raised hands, and swore brotherhood before riding into a storm. It is the story of ordinary fugitives, farm boys, craftsmen, monks without monasteries, who chose a horizon over a master, and by doing so bent. You will hear how a flotilla of low, swift boats could slip past imperial garrisons in midnight silence, how a council of equals could unmake a leader with a shout, how prayers were whispered into beards crusted with frost, and songs lifted over black water toward a moon like a shivering coin. We will walk the reed banks, feel the weight of a saber against the hip, taste smoke and fresh bread, and watch from the edge of the firelight as a new kind of order flickers into life. Come closer to the river. The wind is changing. The torches draw a soft circle on the ground. Beyond it spreads the unruled dark of the steppe, and the first drumbeat of a nation that never quite fit on a map. The river speaks first, not in words, but in a steady, knuckled roar that rises from the Dnipro's granite throat, where water breaks itself into white seams and silver spray. Hear it low, at the start, like breath in a conch shell, then fuller, rounder, until the sound becomes a landscape of its own. Rapids fretting against stone, eddies ticking under driftwood, a distant boom that seems to come from the earth itself. Over that, lighter notes stitch the air, the clink of metal on metal as someone tightens a buckle, the quick, bird-like chatter of gulls and river terns, a single bell far off, folded by wind until it is more memory than chime. Dusk gathers along the reeds. In that hour, when the sky holds both gold and violet, fires bloom one by one across a sandy spit. Small orange planets with their own gravity. Each draws a circle of men, and within each circle, a life is unrolled. A pot rattles gently, where broth and river fish release their salt on iron perfume. Fresh loaves crackle as they cool, the crust blistered, the crumbs steaming. Someone shakes flour from their hands, and the dust hangs like pale smoke in the firelight. Pine resin pops. A curl of smoke wanders upward and carries with it a whole vocabulary of places. Forests upriver, rain-dark roofs, the inside of a chapel where wax burns with a clean sweetness. The steppe begins where the river's breath thins. Out there, the ground goes on and on, wide as a thought that hasn't found its end. Grasses hush against one another in long, slow phrases. At night, the horizon loosens. Stars take up their posts, hard and bright, as if hammered into the firmament, and a faint path of milky fire lays itself across the sky, pointing from nowhere to nowhere. The air has weight to it, a coolness that slips under sleeves, the sort of cool that carries distances. It smells of wild thyme and ash, horse sweat and wet leather, damp straw, and the faint sourness of river mud. Sand makes a soft rasp under boots. Fabrics answer, the coarse drag of undyed wool, the smoother fall of homespun linen, the squeak of belts dressed with tallow. Metal has its own voice, quiet but certain, buckles settling, the patient whisper of a whetstone, a saber's faint sigh when it is eased a finger's width from the sheath and set back again. Listen closer, and the camp arranges itself. A hand rubs beeswax along a bowstring. A spoon taps the iron rim of a pot. A prayer crosses a beard like a secret, syllables tucked low and steady. Laughter flares and fades. A song starts up, 2 voices, then 3, threaded in minor thirds. A tune meant to travel, to carry itself across water and time. A dog turns twice on a blanket and settles with a contented huff. In one corner, a man stitches torn cloth by firelight, the needle biting and releasing. In another, a pair of hands holds a small wooden cross, thumb running the grain smooth. Leather gloves dry on a stake. Boots wait with their toes toward the heat. Shadows shift as someone stands, and for a moment the whole camp seems to breathe in, together. Along the waterline, the boats sleep half in, half out of the river. Low, sleek craft with shallow bellies, their ribs tar black and starlit. Oars are stacked neat as ribs. A coil of rope lies like a sleeping snake. The smell here is different, colder, more metallic. River on one side, wet wood on the other. If you reach to the gunwale, your fingers come away tasting of pitch and pine, and beneath that, something unmistakably alive, the mineral tang of moving water. Farther out, a break in the current makes a dark slick, and in it the moon trembles as if uncertain. The frontier is more than a line on a map. It is a mood that lives in the muscles, a readiness in the neck, a kind of listening that takes in both owl wing and hoofbeat. It is danger, yes, the sense that out beyond the nearest veil of dark, there are eyes watching, hooves turned north or south. That one spark too many could tell the world where you are. But it is also the lift in the chest when the wind changes, the thrill of open land that answers a private hunger for room. Here, rules travel light. A man's word is a passport. Honor is a currency no mint can counterfeit. You feel the bite of that freedom the way you feel the night air. Sharp at first, then bracing, then simply the weather you move within. On the edge of the firelight, tools stand like a quiet alphabet. Axe, awl, ladle, whetstone, hammer. Their handles remember other hands. Beyond them, the world opens into a hallway of starlight, long as a lifetime. In that hallway, the senses learn new scales. Daylight is measured by the angle of a hawk's glide, by the length of a shadow drawn under a wagon wheel. Time itself seems to exhale. An hour can be the slow roasting of a fish, the patient mending of a net, the recitation of a story learned so well it can be told with the eyes closed. Night has chapters, a first dark that is busy with chores, a middle dark where talk softens, a late dark when the embers go dull and the river's voice becomes the only voice. Even here, at the far edge, community braids itself from small acts. A spare bowl passed without asking. A cloak spread over a sleeping shoulder. A glance that asks and answers. Are you well? I'm well. Someone sets a loaf aside for a man expected tomorrow. Someone else repairs a strap for a horse that is not his. The council fire is low now, but around it ideas are waking about how to share water and bread, how to choose a leader and unmake him, how to keep faith with one another when the world presses in. Toward midnight the rapids quiet, or perhaps the ear has learned their measure. The blade of the sky turns black-blue, polished. Smoke thins into nothing. The last song dwindles to a hum, and then to the memory of a hum. It is in this softened hour that the outlines are easiest to see. The camp is not simply a camp. The watch, not simply a watch. It is the beginning of a shape, a way of living that can be carried from island to island and season to season, something assembled from hunger and hope and the stubborn wish to answer only to one another. A pair of oars clicks softly into a boat. Far off, a fox barks once. The wind drifts and brings the faintest bell from a monastery upstream, like a thread tying river to riverbank, men to promise, night to dawn. Out of these threads, smoke and song, bread and blade, the first free brotherhoods will take form. Not yet named, not yet written, but present already in the way the men sit a little closer, in the way the firelight gathers them into a circle, in the way the dark around that circle feels less like a threat and more like a horizon. He left before the rooster could think to speak. A low sky, the color of old pewter, pressed down over the fields. Frost laced the furrows, and every breath came back at him as a pale, startled ghost. Behind the shed, his mother had tied a bundle tight, bread wrapped in a worn linen towel, a strip of dried fish, a bit of lard, a bone-handled knife, and a small icon sewn into the lining. She had not cried. She had stood very straight, both hands on his shoulders, her face a map of everything she did not say. His father had stayed in the doorway and said a single word that could mean both go and forgive me. The landlord had taken the last cow. Rumors said men were being conscripted for someone else's war. The road south was a rumor too, and yet it lay there, brown and stubborn, pointing toward the river. His name was Andriy, the kind of name a bell can carry. He walked with his head down until the village roofs were no more than buttons on a coat left on the floor of the world. A dog followed him as far as the ford and then returned, bored or wise. By noon, he had found the big water moving east, shouldered like a horse in a hurry, and a ferryman who took his last copper without looking him in the eye. A wind came up, the sort that erases tracks. He walked, and when he could not walk, he slept in a ditch and woke with the bread frozen hard as a word on the tongue. Days thinned and thickened. A peddler gave him a ride on a cart and let him chew on licorice root, and told him that south of the last town, on islands strung like beads, there was a place where a man could be measured for who he was and not for whose field he had been born to. On the third dawn, he crested a rise, a bare knuckle of land, and saw the river widen into a lace of channels. Smoke lifted from a low island. The palisade rose beyond it, not high, but quick-looking, the way a fence can look when it is a thought turned into wood. And beyond the palisade, a flag, blue on yellow, loosened and tightened in the wind like a breath. At the causeway, a man in a sheepskin cap held a spear with the tip resting lightly, as if the ground might leap. His mustache was the work of a patient god. "What do you call yourself?" he asked. And Andriy, who had called himself farmhand, son, tenant, fugitive, said simply, "Andriy." The The man's eyes went to the bundle, to the boots, to the hands. "You come to eat our bread and carry our water?" he asked. "I come to work and fight," Andriy said, and the words surprised him by being true. The man nodded once, as if a small decision had been made between two halves of a coin. "Then you will learn the order of things," he said. "You will learn whom to obey and when to speak. You will learn to be brave without being foolish." He stepped aside, and for the first time, Andriy crossed into a place made by choice. They shaved his head that same afternoon, leaving a single forelock to lie like a comma on his crown. The barber's hands were quick and warm. Hair fell around his ears in soft, surprised curls. A deacon from the little chapel by the gate asked him if he was ready to swear, and Andriy found his tongue saying yes before his heart had finished catching up. They led him with 3 other new men to the riverbank, where the water shot past like a living idea. Each man took the gospel in his hands. The deacon spoke, his voice carrying over the rush, and Andriy repeated, to keep the faith, to keep counsel, to keep his brothers' backs, to ask no quarter when the banner was raised, to steal nothing but from the enemy, and then only what could be carried honorably. Cold river spray salted his lips. When it was done, the men around them said Bo Poma and clapped them on the shoulders with a dated gentleness that meant, "Now you are ours, and we are yours." His kurin, the barracks that would be his address, smelled of smoke, leather, and old laughter. 20 men slept there on planks with rolled cloaks under their heads. Above each bed hung a little constellation of personal things: a rosary, a charm against fever, a sprig of mugwort, a spoon polished by years of soup. The Kurini, a square man with a restful gaze, showed Andriy where to put his things and where to sit. "Eat," he said, and a bowl of millet porridge moved toward him, as if on a tide. "Listen more than you speak. You'll get a nickname. Don't fight it. Nicknames are like shoes. First they rub, then they fit." Days created their own grammar. At dawn the bell clanged, and the camp shook itself awake. Men ran a whetstone along sabers and strokes as careful as prayers. Muskets were swabbed and oiled. Locks were checked. Powder horns were weighed by feel. An old man named Yerema showed Andriy how to seat a charge with the right kind of force. Not anger. The rod doesn't need your fury. Give it calm. He taught him to judge the wind and to wait for breath to still before squeezing the trigger. "A gun is just a loud hand," he said. "Learn to use the quiet one too." In the afternoons, there were drills in the yard, horses snorting white into the air, men wheeling in 4s and 8s so that a stranger watching would think the whole world turned on the same invisible hinge. Night put softness on the edges, but even softness here had discipline. The Rada, the council, met by the largest fire. Men spoke who had a right to speak. Others stood and listened and made small, approving sounds when a sentence landed well. The ataman, elected by hands lifted in daylight, sat and did not raise his voice. Andriy found he liked the way decisions were made, not behind doors or on the strength of birth, but with faces open to the light. He liked the small yes that moved through a group like yeast, raising it. Still, fear slept in the same room. It kept their boots pointed toward the door. It sat by the fire with its arms around its knees. On the 5th day, a rider came in at dusk from the reed country with his cloak blown sideways and his horse's neck frothed white. He told of a Tatar party, light and quick, seen moving east along a channel, driving 36 cattle and 2 girls tied in the backs of the saddles. Someone's hand tightened on a ladle. In half an hour, The boats were in the water. The ataman's orders came like stepping stones. 2 chaikas down this channel, 1 to the right. No shots until the lantern is raised. No shouting unless a man is lost, and then you call his name as if it were your own. Andriy had never been on a boat that moved like this. The chaika skated forward in the dark water, barely touching the surface, oars dipping and lifting with the regularity of a sleep-breathing chest. Reed tops whisked against the hull. The river at night was a different creature, all shoulder and hush. The moon laid a white path between black banks. He tasted pitch, his own tongue, something like pennies. Yarema was at his elbow, a hand on Andriy's sleeve when the younger man forgot how to breathe and started again too fast. "Listen," Yarema said softly. "To them, to us, to yourself. The quiet will tell you what to do." They heard the cattle before they saw them. A low, complaining sound, like a conversation between stones. The boats fanned out, slow as moths. On the bank, a lantern bobbed in a human hand. A voice, then 2, then the quick, high whinny of a frightened horse. Andriy's heart climbed into his throat and wedged there, a hard fruit. He thought of his mother's hands and their particular economy, the way she saved pieces of twine and wrapped a cracked cup with cloth. He thought of his father's one word, which had been a kind of blessing dragged through a narrow door. He thought, against his will, of the girls tied to saddles and the way a braid looks when it comes loose. The lantern rose. The ataman's boat slid forward like a thought made sudden. The first shot cracked the night, brief as a curse. Andriy lifted his musket, found the sight, lowered it. For a heartbeat, everything slowed, as if God had pressed 2 fingers on the edge of the world and held it still. In that stillness, he could choose, squeeze and send a clumsy, fearful shout into the dark, or hold and listen for the line between duty and panic. He held. He saw a rider rear his horse and swing to cut a tether. He saw a rope fall. He saw Yarema's oar miss the water and stumble. He saw a man's silhouette lift a curved blade and turn toward Yarema's undefended neck. Andriy fired. The musket kicked his shoulder like a mule. The silhouette flinched oddly and dropped the blade as if it had remembered something else it needed to do. Smoke bloomed, sweet and thick. He did not know whether he had saved Yarema or endangered someone he could not see. The world resumed its speed. Shouts and hoofbeats tumbled together. A cow bolted into the water and made for the moon. A horse splashed after it, rider cursing. The cursing turned into coughing when a second shot found the place where breath begins. Oars beat. Men leaned. Someone fell with a sound like a bag of wheat hitting a plank. It was no long battle, because neither side had come to fight a long battle. Surprise did what surprise does. Purpose ran out on both ends at the same time. When silence returned, it came in sections, as if laying mats over a floor. On the bank, they cut the ropes from the girls' wrists. One had a broken lip and stared at nothing. The other drank water in little bird sips, and then was sick quietly in the reeds. Men spoke to them as if to horses. "Good girl, easy, there you are, like that." A man lay on his side with his hands under him, as if still guarding something precious. The ataman knelt and turned him gently. It was one of theirs. A boy younger than Andriy, his eyes already looking at a place Andriy could not see. Yarema covered the boy's face with his own cloak, smoothing it, then sat back on his heels and put his hand on Andriy's shoulder in a way that held and steadied at once. They moved the cattle toward a village that would wake grateful and confused. They put the girls into a boat with blankets around their shoulders. They lifted their dead and the stranger dead and kept them apart, because the living needed to make this difference, even if the dead did not. Andriy stood with the empty musket and felt his legs shake. The shaking was not fear exactly. It was the body remembering that it is made of water. Back at the island, Dawn made a pale ladder on the palisade. The men carried the boy to the little chapel. The deacon's voice was low and practical. Wax was lit, smoke rose straight for a while, and then wandered. Afterwards, they ate in a silence that was not empty. The ataman said only, "We did what we had to," and then told someone to mend the boat thwart, and someone else to take the cattle on before they were missed. Work restored the world to the size of hands. As the morning lengthened, the story began to shorten itself into sentences men could keep in their pockets. Yarema said to anyone who would listen, "The lad held his shot until there was a good reason for it." And someone else said, "He saw with both eyes." And someone else said, "He will need a name." Names came like weather. Some wasted themselves trying too hard. Others stuck at once, with the certainty of a small, true thing. By sundown, he was Andriy Reed's, because in the first rush, he had knelt with one knee in the wet and risen with green stripes pressed into his trousers like a badge. The name felt strange in his mouth, then less strange, then useful, like an extra pocket. The men who had seen him hesitate did not mock him. Men who had seen him fire did not praise him overly. They treated him as if he had been seen and weighed and found equal to the weight. At the Rada that week, he raised his hand with the others when the ataman's term ended and the council chose another. The old ataman stood and kissed the cross and passed the mace as if it were a sleeping child. Andriy watched how men made power here and unmade it. And something in him loosened that had been knotted since he was 12 and saw his father bend his back in a field to the rhythm of someone else's whip. He took his pay in salt and coin and a length of good wool. He learned to sit a horse so that the horse seemed to move by itself. He learned to drink without becoming loud. He learned to laugh without forgetting. At night, when the camp quieted to the slow pulse of someone's snores, he thought of home. He saw the clay stove and the place on its top where he had slept as a child when winter made the windows rattle. He saw the sparrows that chattered in the thatch. He saw his mother's hands peeling potatoes into the lap of her skirt. The thought of them came like a warm cloth on the brow, and then like a stone. He had written once, on the back of a peddler's bill, with a monk helping him shape the letters, and sent the letter by a wagon headed north. He did not know if it had been received. He carried a coin in his pocket for her, and sometimes he took it out and warmed it with his palm and put it back, as if the warmth could travel through distances to a different pocket sewn into a different dress. Freedom sat beside him. It was not the wild, galloping stallion he had imagined. It was a patient animal that needed feeding every day, responsibility, vigilance, the willingness to rise when it was cold and wet and some other man had called your name. It asked more of him than the manor ever had, and gave more in return: the right to say yes and no, the right to be judged for what he did and not for where he had begun. Honor, he learned, was not a contest with other men. It was a conversation with himself that began again each morning. Fear did not leave him. On the contrary, it moved in and became a neighbor he greeted and made room for. It sat across the table and watched him eat and made sure he remembered to oil the lock and tie the proper knot. It taught him to empty his mind of glory when the oar hit the water, and to keep his thumb out of the trigger guard until the river told him the moment. Some nights, fear crept too close and told stories about men whose luck ran out in the reeds, and about families that watched the road until their eyes watered. On those nights, he would go to the river and listen until the river told a counter-story about carrying and being carried, and then he could lie down on his plank and rest. Spring took the camp in hand. The ice loosened with a noise like a house settling. Willow tips greened. The smell of fish was everywhere, clean and a little arrogant. With the flood came messengers, ragged and scented with distance, with news of uprisings and punishments, and taxes in new shapes. A merchant from a town he had never seen told of a manor burned to its foundation, and named a village 2 valleys from his own. Andriy stood very still while the man spoke. Later, he went behind the chapel and held his breath until stars came out, not only in the sky, but in his eyes. The next day, he asked for leave to go north for a week, and the Karenni looked at him for a time long enough to make the yes mean something, and then nodded. He walked the old road that now knew his step from the other direction. The fields were beleaguered by mud. Crows considered them from fence posts. At the edge of the village, he stood and looked at the roofs as if they were animals that might flee. The house was there, the door the same, the window like a watching eye. His mother opened it and said his name as if she'd been practicing it quietly and now was ready to try it out loud. They sat like people learning again how to sit. She touched his forelock and smiled and cried. His father came in with his cap in his hands and put it down and said that same word that could still mean various things. This time, Andriy heard them all. They spoke until the lamp wanted more oil than they could give it. He told them only what could be told without bringing the river into the room. They told him enough of bad luck to make him understand that leaving had saved him and hurt them in equal measure. A cousin had been taken for a levy. A neighbor had vanished. The landlord steward had a new way of counting grain. Andriy left the coin with his mother and a piece of wool with his sister and a promise with himself that he would come again when he could. In the morning, he kissed the lintel and walked away before language could make staying seem reasonable. On the island, the men were mending nets and singing a song that had a chorus even a returning man could catch. Yarema handed him a new pair of stirrup leathers he had asked the saddler to fashion. "You look taller," Yarema said. "You smell like someone else's oven." Andriy smiled and did not argue. He swung into the saddle and felt the horse gather under him, ready to move when he moved. He looked toward the reeds, where the channels made their secrets, and toward the palisade, where the flag unrolled and rolled itself again, like a habit. He had not solved anything large. He had cut no new law into the world, but he had learned the taste of a word he had only guessed at before. Brother. There would be more nights on the water, more raids avoided or won, more councils where the question would not be obvious, and men would have to hold silence like a tool until the right answer felt itself into being. There would be years when the river dropped and the fish did not run, and years when plenty made generosity easy. There would be letters sent and not received, and odd gifts that took 3 towns to find the right hands. He would put away his first musket and take up a better one. He would make a small notch inside the gunwale of a boat for each man carried home who would not have walked that distance, and no one would ever know how many notches belonged to him, because those numbers were always stored in breath and sleep, and the way a man sat with his back to a wall. For now, in this evening that comes on like a friend slipping into the room, he stands in the yard while the horses snort and the pots clatter and the bell marks an hour that means food. The sky is the color of ash, washed thin, and then warmed at the edges by a hand. The river says what it always says. His name comes from 3 directions. Andriy reads, brother, and he answers to each without choosing between them. In the camp's ordinary light, under a flag that lifts and settles with the patience of breath, a life is being built. Its beams are choices. Its roof is trust. If you walk from fire to fire, you can feel the shape of it with your palms. A young man, once a tenant of someone else's field, now carries his own harvest. A sobriety about danger, a workable fondness for honor, a loyalty that does not erase longing. His fear is with him. So is his courage. So is the memory of a kitchen where potatoes hit the bottom of a pot with the sound of bells. He belongs to the river and to the men and to a future none of them can see yet. And as the first stars cut their clean points into the sky, the story of one fugitive softens into the larger murmur of a brotherhood rising. Not yet history, not yet legend, but already the beginning of both. By daylight, the Sich looks almost simple. A low palisade, a bell, a scatter of barracks, a chapel whose little cupola gathers sun like a cupped hand. But what lives inside that fence is a grammar of freedom learned by heart. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not come from a book. It grew the way river islands grow, layer by patient layer, carried forward by floods of need and settled by the weight of custom. Older men speak of a prince who first planted a wooden fort on a rock above the rapids, of rafts chained together against the current, of watchfires seen from miles away, of the steppe drawing men the way the sea draws ships. The palisade moved over the years, from island to island, branch to branch of the Dnipro. What stayed was the idea that here, at this noisy threshold between forest and steppe, a brotherhood could be built on oath, craft, and vote. They called the whole of it the Sich part camp, part school, part court, part harbor. The word itself carries the sound of chopping wood, of cutting a place out of wildness. Its bones were the kurens, the barracks communities that were both households and regiments. Each kuren had its own hearth, its own stores, its own banner and pride. Above the kurens stood officers they elected and could unelect, the ataman to lead and negotiate, the judge to keep the law, the scribe to hold the memory in ink, the osal to keep order in the field, the standard bearer to guard the symbol that gathers men, like a magnet gathers filings. None wore crowns. Their power was the kind that dissolves if it is not watched. It existed because the men agreed, and ended when the men unagreed. The heart and mouth of this democracy was the Rada, the council called under open sky. When the bell spoke, men came with the dust of whatever chore was in their hands, net mending, horse curried half clean, pot left to simmer, and stood in a great listening. Here, a man's voice counted as long as his record did. Here, an officer could be lifted high on the strength of his judgment and set down again with no insult, because the office belonged to the common good, not to the man. Votes were hands raised, voices together, sometimes a roar like surf, sometimes a patient murmur. Decisions were not polished into marble phrases. They were shaped to fit the day's need and the brotherhood's conscience. Andriy learned quickly what the rules looked like when they were not written on paper. You do not lay hands on a brother in anger. You do not drink when the boats are being readied. You do not steal bread, horse, honor, because theft is the shortest road back to a life without trust. You do not keep what the community needs. You do not keep a leader who forgets that his voice is borrowed from the men who gave it to him. Punishments were often quick and public, a way of making the law visible so it could be remembered with the eyes. Mercy, too, lived in the yard, an older man seated beside a younger, a fault acknowledged by both, a rope of shame cut before it could harden. Daily life was an art of necessities. The Sich ate like river people and steppe people at once. In the morning, porridge thick enough to stand a spoon, maybe sweetened with honey if a beekeeper had been kind, or brightened with a scatter of dried berries saved against winter. At midday, borscht, sour and generous, the color of sunset peeled into a pot, fish pulled from the current and persuaded into a broth that tasted of iron and clean water. Salo sliced thin and salted, broken over bread still warm enough to fog a knife. On good days, there was roast carp slashed so the heat could find its way to the bone. Garlic pressed to glow on the tongue, and a jug of kvass cooled in the river itself. Hands were the first utensils. Spoons came next. Knives were tools before they were weapons. Clothing was what the land and trade provided. In the chill months, sheepskin turned inside out. Warmth held close. Over linen shirts, men wore fitted coats, jupons, that could be belted for work or unbelted for rest, and wide trousers, sharovari, that answered a horse's back with comfort. Boots took grease like bread takes butter. On feast days, the colors gathered: crimson sashes, indigo-dyed wool, a strip of foreign braid bought with prize money. Most men kept their heads shaved smooth with a single forelock, the osaletets falling like a comma over the temple, as if the head itself were a sentence that might continue. Mustaches came in varieties that were their own private jokes. Practical things had an elegance bred of use. A pistol tucked into a sash not to threaten, but because hands do other work. A saber hung low, so it could be drawn without drama. Songs did the heaviest lifting in the evenings. A tune might begin with one man and his kobza or bandura, the strings speaking in a voice like weathered wood, and gather voices the way a river gathers smaller waters. The ballads, dummy, were long and supple, histories sung in the minor key. They remembered a comrade who did not return, a fortress taken by craft, a bargain made and regretted, a mother's counsel before a son set out. The melody could be carried by a single breath and yet hold a room full of men in one timeless beat. Singing here was not decoration. It was record, therapy, witness, prayer. Even men too shy to sing learned the refrains, and the refrains learned them back. The chapel stood close to the council yard, on purpose. Faith had a practical chair at every table. The men kept feasts and fasts as they could, blessed the water before setting out, wore small wooden crosses rubbed smooth by thumb and years. Priests came and went with the seasons, serving liturgy in a voice that could calm a crowd or set it quivering, anointing wounds and boats alike. Icons traveled, some from famous monasteries upriver, others made by hands not yet famous. Faces of saints painted with gold leaf that caught the morning, their eyes meeting a man's gaze as if to ask a question, and answer it at the same time. Orthodoxy here tasted of smoke and beeswax and iron, of bread broken after a vote, of forgiveness negotiated in the yard. If the Sich cheerfully borrowed tricks and spices from every border it touched, its soul kept to the old calendar. In that keeping, many found the spine of their courage. Women, as a rule, did not live inside the Sich. The place had a monastic echo, a deliberate narrowness meant to keep attention clean for war and work. Yet women braided through its life just beyond the fence, in fairy towns and fishing hamlets, in markets where cloth and salt and stories were traded, in homes where letters were read aloud to listeners who had waited all winter for a spring boat. Mothers sent blessings wrapped in herbs. Wives sent jokes and practical requests. Daughters asked their fathers to describe the river so they could see it without being seen by it. The absence within made the presence without feel larger, like a constellation seen because of the night around it. Around the palisade spread a country that did not know how to be simple. To the northwest lay the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a grand, argumentative republic of nobles and parliaments whose freedoms did not always reach their peasants. Kings there had long alternated between courting Cossack strength and fearing Cossack independence. Lured with pay and recognition, a portion of the brotherhood became the registered Cossacks, counted on royal rolls, given muskets stamped with seals, promised rights that could be made to vanish when the ink dried. The register was always too small for the number of men who believed they had earned a place on it. Between the promise and the shortfall grew grievances like brush in a dry season, taxes sharpened into blades, lords who spoke of liberty for themselves and obedience for their tenants, officers who tried to yoke a river with paper. And yet markets tied lives across the border. Wheat shipped north, salt shipped south, godparents named across confessional lines, a Polish saddle on a Cossack horse, a Cossack tune rising under a nobleman's window when the wine was good. To the northeast stood Muscovy, a rising power with thick walls and long winters, a tsardom where obedience flowed downward like snowmelt from roofs. Orthodoxy was a shared tongue, and in that shared tongue, the Sich sometimes found a friend's accent. When enemies pressed from the west or south, messengers traveled up the long river roads with letters asking for alliance, grain, gunpowder, guarantees. From the Kremlin came decrees written in careful Cyrillic, warm promises in cold ink. The Cossacks listened and bargained and kept a part of themselves unpromised, because the gift of protection can carry a price that arrives later with officials and seals and a different map of what you are allowed to be. Some winters, the alliance meant salt in the pot. Some summers it meant a chain laid quietly across the spirit and called security. To the south opened the Black Sea like a lung, and along its rim perched the Ottoman Empire, minarets pricking the sky, arsenals clanging, a court in Constantinople, Istanbul, that weighed provinces the way a jeweler weighs stones. Between the steppe and that court rode the Crimean Khanate, fierce and fast, its horsemen mastering the art of arrival and departure, its economy braided horribly with the slave markets that clustered at the sea's edge. Tatars could be enemies in one season, allies in another, neighbors always, men who knew the same stars and winds, who traded horses for cloth, salt for grain, blows for blows. The Ottomans sent envoys with velvet words and iron terms. Sometimes they paid for quiet on the river. Sometimes they punished noise with fleets. The Sich read these signals like weather and chose its days accordingly, arguing at the Rada until the choice felt more like necessity than whim. In this press of empires, the Cossacks learned the old art of being a hinge. They tilted toward one power or another to keep their own door open. It was not perfidy, it was survival for a border people whose only constant was the river and the oath. And in all these tiltings, one purpose returned like a refrain: to guard the villages behind them from raids that tore families apart, and to insist, in the vocabulary of boats and blades, that faith and custom were not to be priced by distant men in silk. So the Brotherhood stood at the gate of the steppe and called themselves guardians of the Orthodox way. This did not make them angels. It made them stubborn. When a church's bell was taken down to be melted, they remembered it. When priests were hounded or monasteries taxed past breathing, they remembered that too. Their defense of faith was rarely a sermon. It was a convoy, a warning, a raid. They escorted pilgrims along dangerous roads, rebuilt wooden chapels with their own hands, urged a frightened village to stay, not scatter. On feast days, the liturgy's long cadences calmed tempers better than any law could. On ordinary days, a cross traced in ash on a door was a promise. We passed by as brothers, not as takers. And then there were the chaikas, the little hard boats with bulging sides and low profiles, tarred so black they seemed to carry night with them into noon. With these, the river people became, in the right weather, a sea people. They learned the coastal currents as they had learned the channels among reeds. They watched the wind for its changing mind. They slipped past Ottoman forts in the hour when sentries blinked the grit from their eyes, oars wrapped in felt, so the only sound was the small, repeated decision of wood entering water. They went where larger ships could not follow, into estuaries, around sandbars, up canals like veins. They struck at slave ports to free captives, at war galleys to take supplies, at garrisons that grew fat on tribute. The aim was not senseless destruction. It was punctuation, a dash imposed on a line the Ottomans believed ran only one way. Andrei stood more than once on a Black Sea beach that belonged to no one and everyone, squinting into a dawn that opened like a wound and then healed into gold. Sand worked into everything: boots, bread, laughter. Seabirds wrote looping alphabets across the air. In those hours, the Brotherhood was bigger than any border. Men from different rivers, speaking different dialects, fixed the same oarlocks, tightened the same knots, agreed to the same signals. Risk here did not shout. It hummed, steady as the surf. They knew the price of daring. They also knew the cost of not daring. A countryside harvested for slaves, a village burned, a bell sold for scrap. Trade came along these same waters. It always does. Salt moved and wax and hides and tails. A man could sell a bolt of steppe-woven cloth in a Black Sea port and bring back coffee grounds in a pouch, and stories about a city where gates never closed and men prayed 5 times a day, and the call to prayer was as beautiful as any hymn. He might be on the same key a month later for a different purpose, and this duality did not worry him. It was the world's duality, not his. The Sich kept a chest for such earnings, not because it was hoarding wealth, but because winter always comes, and flood always follows drought. If you walked the perimeter of the palisade at dusk, you could hear the social machinery tick as gently as a well-kept clock. A Kurian sharing grain with another whose catch had failed. Disputes settled by witnesses who remembered more than they preferred to. A scribe slowly shaping a letter for a man whose hands knew oars better than pens. A young one, new-voiced, learning when to speak, and when to let the elders' sentences braid into something he could trust. Hospitality given and taken, altars of bread and salt appearing between people who had not met that morning. And through it all, the slow, civil courage of a community that understood its own circumference. The Sich was not perfect. No place of men is. But it had a talent for keeping itself from becoming its enemies. It mistrusted pomposity, punished cruelty, laughed at bragging. It assumed, daily, that dignity was not something a lord awards, but something a man builds. That is why it held votes in daylight. That is why the mace passed from hand to hand with tenderness. That is why the chapel's door was never locked. When storms gathered, the kind on maps and the kind in men, the brotherhood met them not only with sharpened steel, but with a sharpened sense of who they were. The personal and the public were not separate rooms. The wall between them was wicker, and what happened in one passed air to the other. Andrew's fear and courage belonged to him, yes, but they also belonged to the Rada, because a vote without the courage to carry it into the reeds is just sound. Because fear admitted and managed is the difference between a raid that brings captives home and one that brings grief. As the sun slips and the river begins its evening talk, the Sich lays down its day. The bell counts the hour. The dogs lift their heads and put them back down. Smoke thins into the pale, honeyed sky. A priest snuffs candles with a practiced hand. A scribe sands a page. An ataman, no longer ataman as of the afternoon's vote, walks out with an easy step and sits among men who will follow someone else tomorrow without losing themselves. At the fence line, reeds lean toward the water, listening as if to a familiar story. Beyond the reeds, empires rearrange themselves like furniture in a distant house. Here, the voices fold into song again, and the words are old and serviceable. Brother, oath, bread, river, road, God. In their weave, you can hear the pattern the Sich chose and chooses still, night by fragrant night, to be a small country of consent in a large world of command, to answer raids with rescue and pressure with presence, to carry faith without sharpening it into a spear, to go to sea in little boats and return to council in the open air, to be, in a border century, both a wall and a window. History, when it gathers itself, can feel like a storm that was always brewing in the reeds. The small daily agreements of the Sich, the oath, the council, the bread passed around the circle, were not mere village habits. They were tinder. In 1648, a man with a wounded dignity and an uncommon talent for turning grievance into grammar set a spark to that tinder, and the flame rose high enough to be seen from Krakow to Constantinople. His name was Bohdan Khmelnytsky. The story the old men tell begins on a smaller stage: an estate wronged, a child lost, a noble steward leaning too hard on a man whose patience had limits. When petitions failed, Khmelnytsky rode south to the islands and asked the Brotherhood for a hearing. The appeal he made was larger than his personal sorrow. He spoke for peasants, bent by the weight of dues, for priests whose bells and books had been taxed into silence, for registered Cossacks whose names were struck out when their usefulness had been counted for the season. He spoke with a rhythm that made men want to tap their fingers in time. He found allies where border people find them, in the reeds, among exiles, and in a tent far south where the Crimean Khan weighed bets like a seasoned card player. With Islam Giray III, he made a compact sharp enough to cut history. Tatar horse would ride with Cossack foot. The river would lend its boats. Anger would lend its wind. The first blows fell quick and precise. Zhovty Vody, Korsun, Piliavtsi, names that, when sung in the long vowels of a dummy, sound like oars dipping in perfect unison. Royal armies broke on unfamiliar tactics. Infantry that could move like water between reed and ridge. Wagon forts that unfolded in the grass. Muskets that spoke from behind timber as low as a man's waist. A cavalry that understood the steppe's logic better than any parade ground ever has. Villages rose behind the victories, as if bravery were contagious. The uprising became a war for order, not just against a lord or a levy, but against the shape of life that made lords and levies the only answers anyone knew. By autumn of 1648, Khmelnytsky entered Kiev to bells ringing and streets crowded with faces upturned like flowers after drought. The city made room for him the way a heart makes room for a sudden thought. In churches where candle smoke had thinned and voices had grown cautious, the chants thickened and rose. A hetmanate formed, less a state than a habit of acting together. Regiments with their banners, officers elected in the old way, chanceries where scribes learned to stretch parchment and truth just enough to keep fragile alliances whole. The war reordered society for a time. Serfs found themselves not bent, but standing. Priests spoke louder. The bounds of who could speak for the community were tested, and for a time widened. But all storms have their counterwinds. Khmelnytsky, like every leader caught between hope and geography, had to choose which empire's shadow offered enough shade to keep the sapling from burning. To hold gains and keep raiders off the flanks, he reached north and east. In 1654, at Pereyaslav, he and his officers swore an oath with envoys of the Tsardom of Muscovy. The scene, remembered and re-remembered until it seems carved into the riverbank itself, was both practical and devotional. A cross kissed, a promise spoken with enough ceremony to satisfy the priests and enough vagueness to comfort the politicians. The Cossack understanding leaned toward autonomy kept under a distant hand. The Muscovite understanding leaned toward obedience promised under a near one. Between those leanings a crack opened that would widen in the years to come. Khmelnytsky's victory gave millions a taste of breath in a chest that had forgotten how to fill. It also invited old neighbors to return with new maps. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fought not to lose its richest borderland. Muscovy fought not to gain only a friend, but to gain a province. The Crimean Tatars, allies of the first hour, fought as Tatars have often fought, to maintain the balance that keeps the steppe profitable. And the Ottoman Porte watched as a chess player watches when two opponents begin to crowd each other with interest and offers. When Khmelnytsky died in 1657, the brotherhood he had gathered stood like a raft newly launched, half lashed, half faith. Then came the years Ukrainians call, with a grim accuracy, the ruin. The word does not describe a single catastrophe. It names a season when the future was the most fragile thing in the room. Hetmans rose and fell like banners in a shifting wind. Ivan Vyhovsky reached westward and signed the Treaty of Hadiak in 1658, a bold promise to make a Grand Duchy of Rus a third pillar beside Poland and Lithuania. For a year, it seemed possible that the Commonwealth's grand language about liberty might be forced to include the people who had heard only its echo. Vyhovsky's army then broke a Muscovite host at Konotop in 1659, a field victory large enough to ring across Europe. But inside the camp, the cords frayed. Some Cossack ranks distrusted the noble heavy terms of Hadiak. Others trusted neither Muscovite decrees nor Polish charms. The victory could not hold the coalition that had won it. Elsewhere, Yuri Khmelnytsky, Bohdan's son, wore the mace and set it down more than once, leaning now toward Moscow, now toward Warsaw, now toward the Ottomans, and finding in each direction both generosity and leash. Pavlo Teteria tried the western door and found it guarded by old suspicions. Ivan Mazepa courted Moscow so hard that he bound the left bank tight and then paid for it with his life at the hands of men who felt the cord around their own throats. Petro Doroshenko, proud and fierce, turned toward the Ottoman road in 1669, taking the Sultan's protection in hopes of balancing two great neighbors with a third. The price was Chai-Hiran, the hetman's capital, burned and rebuilt and fought over until the very ashes seemed tired of choosing sides. In chancelleries far away, men with ink on their thumbs drew a line through the middle of the river's history. The Truce of Andrusovo in 1667, confirmed and dressed more formally as the Eternal Peace of 1686, divided the Hetmanate along the Dnipro. The left bank, to the east, with Kiev lent like a book and then kept, fell under Moscow's patient weight. The right bank, to the west, was tugged and battered by the Commonwealth and the Ottoman Khanate pairing. Families found their sons on different sides of a border neither had chosen. Priests used one calendar in towns where soldiers marched to another. A letter could die of old age trying to find the hand it was meant for. The Sich, uninclined to draw lines on water, shifted and adapted, keeping its identity like a fire a man carries under his cloak through rain. Even in the ruin, the Hetmanate kept the habits that made it something more than a garrison. Courts sat, regimental chanceries filed and stamped. Land was granted and regretted and litigated. The Starshina, the officer class, rose in consequence and began to look like a nobility of a new kind. The same democracy that had elected an ataman in the yard now learned the limits of elections. Once wealth, mills, salt works, fisheries could be counted. Autonomy was negotiated daily, not romantically. A tax promised, a garrison tolerated, a letter phrased to sound loyal and independent in the same paragraph. Each concession had the logic of weather. Necessary in a given season, always prelude to another bargaining. Andrei lived through this as a man lives through a long winter, by keeping the stove fed, by watching the sky, by helping the neighbors patch a roof that is not his, because houses make neighborhoods, and neighborhoods are what get through storms. He ferried envoys from one bank to the other and learned the different flavors of seal wax, the musky beeswax of a Polish voivode's desk, the sharp resin of a Muscovite prikaz, the perfumed impression carried by an Ottoman savush with excellent manners and careful eyes. He saw Doroshenko ride, straight-backed even when the news was crooked. He saw Vyhovsky win on the field and lose in the alley behind the field, where politics waits with a damp cloth and a cold smile. He learned to mistrust promises that arrived with drums, to favor those that arrived with ledgers, and to respect most of all the promises men made one another in their own language, without witnesses. From the Ottoman side, the Cossacks were a problem written in water. Impossible defense, necessary to consider. Istanbul's chroniclers note Kazaklar the way a farmer notes hail, by damage and direction, complaining of Chaika-born raids that burned storehouses and freed captives, of sudden coastal appearances that forced the empire to keep one eye rimward, even when its thoughts were in Persia or on the Danube. From the Commonwealth side, they were both shield and thorn. The nobility loved a Cossack victory against Tatar or Turk, and detested a Cossack parliament against noble privilege. They hired them for campaigns abroad and starved the register at home. From the Muscovite vantage, the Cossacks were a mirror and a mystery. Moscow knew its own Don and Yike brotherhoods, fierce, free-speaking communities that combined faith with stubbornness, and thus recognized both the uses and dangers of such men. To bring the Zaporizhian family into the Tsar's obedience was to harness a powerful horse. To let it keep deciding where to run was to be dragged. Even so, the Cossack name traveled farther than the range of their muskets. A French engineer, Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, who had surveyed fortresses for Polish commanders, took home a book called Description d'Ukraine. In Paris salons, men and women in stiff collars traced with a finger the courses of rivers they would never see, and repeated the pleasing word, Cossacks, as if tasting a spice. Later, Voltaire, writing about King Charles XII of Sweden, found room for Mazepa and the people he led, painting them in the colors French readers expected of the steppe: swift, dangerous, inconvenient to kings. In Istanbul, coffeehouse storytellers rolled the word Cossack around as a cautionary tale and a boast. Beware the river ghosts. Admire how hard they are to catch. In German principalities, recruiting officers learned to say it as a threat to keep their own soldiers from deserting. Walk too far, and the Cossacks will have you. In Moscow, centuries later, the name would be borrowed to describe horsemen who rode into Paris after Napoleon's fall. These were not Zaporizhians, but the word did not care. It had become a signal for steppe-born speed and suddenness. The Cossacks' reputation was not only about warfare. Travelers wrote with a certain envy about the Republic of Warriors, where leaders were chosen and unchosen in open air, where a poor man could rise on the strength of sense and courage, where a council could bind men to a decision without binding their souls. These descriptions were sometimes romantic, sometimes exact, often both. But they left a mark. Somewhere in the minds of Europeans, amid polite conversations about constitutions and compacts, there lingered the idea of a people who had invented, on a sandbar between empire and emptiness, a practical freedom. No philosopher required, just oars and votes and a bell. Back on the river, the ruin wore itself out by degrees. By the late 17th century, the left bank settled under a more predictable, narrower autonomy. Hetmans elected but confirmed by czars, a general military chancellery copying edicts late into the night, regimental towns that looked like small capitals, bustling and proud. The right bank emptied and refilled like a tide pool. Wars, Chaihiran campaigns, treaties, resettlements, until some villages became more memory than place. The Sich endured as a hinge, a refuge, an irritation. At once the most conservative and most radical corner of the Cossack world, holding fast to the old compact. Even as the Hetmanate learned to wear a coat cut closer in Moscow, Andriy grew older in that narrowing space with the adaptable dignity of men who do not confuse change with defeat. He learned the new routes required to avoid new customs posts. He learned to answer new officials with the old courtesy, and to keep a little silence in his pocket for when courtesy ran thin. When word came of treaties with ambitious names, eternal this, perpetual that, he nodded and checked the river level, because rivers tell truths that paper cannot. When Doroshenko finally laid down his mace and lived out his days in a different uniform, Andriy said a prayer into his beard and lifted a plank to inspect a boat's ribs, because the Black Sea did not care who governed Chaihiran. and hungry men would always need a ride. To the end of his prime, he still took the Chaika out past the bar, where fresh water becomes salt. He still felt that tremor in the hands, part fear, part delight, when the current and the tide argued under the keel. He still believed, without the need to declare it, that the point of all the voting and all the rowing was to keep a space in the world where a man could come as he was and be taught how to be better by men who would never own him. He had learned, from Khmelnytsky's surge and from the ruin's long, lean years, that freedom is not one victory, but a habit of saying no at the right moment and yes at the right work. A habit of remembering that alliances are bridges, not homes. A habit of singing the same song when fortunes are loud and when they are very quiet. If you stand with him on a sandbar and look south, the horizon is Ottoman. Look west, and it is Commonwealth. Look north and east, and it is Muscovite. Turn in a slow circle, and the world keeps changing names. But underfoot, the sand feels like the sand his younger feet knew. On the air, the bell from an island chapel carries its familiar, tin-bright tone. In his palm, the scratched wooden cross still tells the same story with no words at all. Somewhere beyond the next bend, the figures of later years are already walking toward us. Ivan Mazepa, Charles XII, a field near Poltava where choices distilled into fate. The world will keep calling the Cossacks what suits it: pirates, patriots, rebels, border guards, freebooters, defenders of faith. They will answer as they have always answered, with a shrug, a grin, a tug on a forelock, a vote, and a willingness to launch boats in the hour before dawn. And across capitals, from Istanbul's docks to Paris's drawing rooms, their name will remain shorthand for a kind of unruly competence that empires respect, even as they plan to reduce it. That is the odd, honest victory of a river-born people. To become, in other tongues, a metaphor for freedom that governments fear and poets can't resist. The map will never show the full outline of that victory. But if you listen, especially at night, with water moving over stone and the wind leaning on the reeds, you can still hear it. The murmur of a counsel, the lift of a refrain, the scratch of a scribe, the splash of oars in a narrow channel. History keeping time with a people who learned to be themselves at the edge of everyone else's plans. The sea took their measure before any court did. In the seasons when the Dnipro ran high and the reeds whispered of salt, the Chaikas slid past the forts like thoughts no sentry could catch. Oars wrapped in felt, sails lowered to the color of night. They ghosted along the Black Sea rim, leaving rumors behind. Fires in a slave port, chains broken in a warehouse, a watchtower's alarm swallowed by surf. There were mornings when fishermen near Sinop found pilings still warm. Afternoons when the markets at Kaffa broke into shouting, and then into stunned silence. And a handful of nights when flames in the suburbs of the Sultan's own city smudged the horizon so dark that palace windows carried their reflection. It was not piracy for the joy of disorder. It was punctuation. Sharp dashes across a sentence the empire preferred to write without interruption. On land, the Brotherhood proved it could stand as well as fly. In 1621, at Khotin, Cossack infantry in their stubborn wagon forts, shoulder to shoulder with the Commonwealth's army, stopped the young Ottoman Sultan the way a low reef stops a charging sea. Day after day, the steppe men's muskets barked from behind timber and trench. Day after day, sorties threw back janissaries who had never learned the word enough. When the campaign ended, it ended not with a crown on the field, but with a fact. The Sultan turned back. News galloped ahead of the soldiers. through Moldavian valleys, across Polish plains, into German taverns where maps were explained with cups and crumbs. The word Cossack learned then to wear a second meaning, not only raider, but keeper. Decades wheeled. Empires adjusted their chairs. Along the Don and the lower Dnipro, another chapter open. The Azov campaigns. Shipwrights from the rivers taught a Tsar's men how to think like water. Chaikas and new-built craft pressed the Sea of Azov until the Ottoman garrison at the mouth of the Don yielded in a way no one had thought possible. It was a victory claimed by a northern monarch, recorded by officials who preferred neat lines and seals, but the handwriting in the margins belonged to the oar and the reed. For a moment, the Black Sea's northern door swung on different hinges. For a moment, it seemed that when the Sultan counted his coastal forts at night, he would now do his sums with an unwelcome new caution. And then the story lifted into a thinner air where decisions weigh more. A man of lances and libraries stepped forward. Ivan Mazepa. He wore power like someone who had studied it. Careful, exact, courtly. He could sit a horse all day and an embassy all night. Under him, churches rose in a baroque that made the sky itself seem ornamented. Schools took root. The Hetmanate's paper grew more confident even when its borders did not. At first, he rode alongside a northern reformer, Peter, whose appetite for order and ships needed Cossack skill. Together, they struck south. Together, they made strong neighbors remember that the steppe had owners. But the price of partnership showed itself, as prices do. Garrisons settled where votes had once been enough. The ink on charters began to run in ways that always favored the hand that held the pen. Taxes learned new names. Obligations acquired the weight of iron. Mazepa read the pattern and looked west, to a king who traveled light and fought fast, a sovereign whose victories had made winter itself look clumsy, Charles XII of Sweden. In the breathing space before armies arrive, the hetman wagered that with Swedish steel and Cossack ground, with the Commonwealth's weariness and the port's watchful interest, there might be just enough room to lift the old oath into a modern sovereignty. Not a fantasy on a drumhead, but a state. Laws voted by men who knew each other's names. Revenues counted where they were raised. Churches singing in their own voice without asking leave. For a handful of months, the dream felt weighty enough to leave tracks. The answer came first as smoke. Baturin, the hetman's proud capital, granaries full, archives neat, a bell that rang like new silver, fell to Menshikov, and fire. What could not be carried away was burned. What could be broken was broken. What could be silenced was silenced. The loss was not only of walls, it was of a center, a proof to the world that the Hetmanate could be more than a marching camp. Even so, Mazepa did not fold. He met Charles in the open, an old statesman and a young king under a sky that had learned the colors of war too well, and set his last stakes on the table. Poltava came with summer's heat, dust already on the tongue by dawn. The Swedes were hungry and limping from a winter that had not been kind. The Russians had dug their earthworks like a man digs his mind in. Cossacks were divided, some at Mazepa's side, others bound to earlier oaths, many trying to reconcile a loyalty to their own with the fact of power leaning from the north. The morning staggered into afternoon. Assaults that should have been thunder were only storm clouds. The king, who had galloped across Europe, found his horse mired in the careful mud of someone else's prepared field. Cannon spoke in the flat, unforgiving voice of mathematics. By day's end, the map had decided to prefer certainty over romance. They withdrew. king and hetman together, south toward the Dnipro, and then into Ottoman lands, carrying what could be carried: a wounded monarch's stubborn fire, an old leader's unread letters, a portable idea. Behind them, uniforms arranged themselves triumphantly around a victory that would loom for centuries. Ahead of them, the border breathed like a sleeping animal, warm and indifferent. It is possible to say with accuracy that at Poltava, the Cossack dream broke. It is just as true to say that there, for a little while before noon, it was most visible. A network of regiments, a capital with archives and bakeries, alliances chosen rather than inherited, an identity willing to name itself a country. Imagine the other ledger. If a supply train had arrived on time, if a fort had been taken at first rush, if a single bridge had held against the day's heat, then documents drawn in exile might have been issued from a town hall at home. Then the phrase, "under Swedish protection," could have been a staging ground and not a label. Then envoys might have crossed Europe with more than eloquence. The Ottoman Porte, always interested when the wind shifts, might have found it profitable to recognize a buffer that could also be a partner. The Commonwealth, newly cautious, might have learned to enshrine what it had too long tried to rent. Moscow, respecting fact as it always respects fact, might have adjusted rather than absorbed. None of this happened. All of it almost could have. When night finally took the last light off the field at Poltava, the bellies of the clouds were the color of old iron. Men on both sides made the same tired motions, binding wounds, counting the missing, telling the day to itself in a way that made it survivable. Somewhere far from the trenches, a river kept moving as if nothing had occurred. Somewhere closer, an icon's gold leaf caught a candle and returned it with tender stubbornness. Mazepa, who had bet a lifetime's shrewdness on one last throw, would die beyond the border, his body carried by men who had called him father and traitor in the same week. Charles would live to fight again and again until his luck learned a new language. The Hetmanate would go on, narrowed, supervised, clever in small rooms. But it would go on. As for the Brotherhood, it took this climax into itself the way seasoned wood takes flame, not by roaring, but by glowing. They remembered the sea raids and Khotin and Azov as proof that the world can be nudged by small craft and steady hands. They remembered Baturin as a lesson about storing too much hope in one place. They remembered Poltava as the hour when the door opened and then shut, and they set that memory like an ember in their common hearth. A nation that never fit comfortably on a map had reached for the map's pen. The line it drew was brief and beautiful and unfinished. And yet, under the ashes, the tip stayed warm. Defeat did not arrive as a single trumpet blast. It came the way frost comes. First a lace at the edges of puddles, then a brittleness in the grass, and finally a sheet you could skate on. After Poltava, the room the Hetmanate had made for itself narrowed year by year. Orders now came folded with seals that did not need local hands to open them. Garrisons settled like heavy furniture in towns where the bell once called both to prayer and to council. The mace still passed, but more often it passed with permission. The old language of "we decide" learned to share space with the new language of "it has been decided." Some changes wore the polite face of reform. Registers were revised. Courts were improved. The Starshina, Cossack officers now with estates and ledgers, discovered that a man of the steppe could be taught to sit in a capital's chair. Titles were offered like winter coats. Many found them warm. The ink that once kept the Brotherhood's memory now kept inventories and genealogies that fitted neatly into imperial books. Meanwhile, borders that had been negotiated in the open air were redrawn in rooms where air grew stale. The river still spoke its confident grammar, but a new punctuation entered the speech of men. Permits, audits, decrees. Andriy felt it first in the hands. Paper touched everything. To move salt from one bend of the river to another required more documents than rope. To vote a local road repaired, men had to wait for a signature from a far desk, where the only roads were corridors. He did not hate the officials who arrived in neat boots. He pitied them a little for not knowing the names of the winds. He learned their manners, answered their questions, and kept the habit of looking over their shoulders toward the water. In 1764, the title that had steadied the center, Hetman, was set aside as if it were an old tool no longer required. A collegium took its place, tidy and competent, and with it the last large pretense that the partnership was equal. The Sich endured still, a hard kernel of the older order, moved and remade over the decades yet stubbornly itself. The men there could still gather in the open and decide a thing with their hands, could still shave their heads for summer, and sing a dummy that made a night feel like home. They took service when the empire called, fought in the south when the empire wanted southern borders secured, returned with their share of glory and their share of questions. Then came a treaty that shifted the wind, an Ottoman paper signed in a coastal town with a name that tasted of salt, with the southern frontier quieter and the Black Sea's keys changing hands. The empire looked north at the old brotherhood and saw not a shield but a shape that no longer fit the furniture. In the spring of 1775, when the steppe smells of wormwood and wet earth, columns of soldiers closed in on the Sich with the slow confidence of men who carry the future's paperwork in their pockets. There was no heroic last stand. The palisade had seen too many winters. The cannon did not face the right corners of the sky, and the order was clear. The Ataman counted his men and his chances and chose not to pour blood into a ditch that led nowhere. The gates opened. Muskets were stacked. The bell that had called to council was silenced by hands that did not know its tone. Decrees were read out in steady voices. The archive, years of strokes and signatures, quarrels and reconciliations, was boxed. Catherine's officials spoke of gratitude for past service and of the need for uniformity now that security had been won. Some listeners flushed with anger, some with shame, some with the helpless blush of men who have lived long enough to recognize the logic of power when it arrives dressed as reason. Leaders were led away. One old man sent north into a stone and snow silence where the calendar is written by ice. Others accepted transfer and rank. The Brotherhood's best riders found themselves enrolled in new hosts with new names and familiar duties, patrolling farther ranges, pushing the frontier's line toward other rivers. A portion slipped south into Ottoman lands, and in the reeds of a different delta, they planted the seeds of a Danubian Sich, a stubborn echo that refused to learn the imperial melody. The rest went home the way men do when there is no home to go to. They became soldiers in someone else's uniform, farmers on someone else's schedule, singers who kept their best songs soft. So ended the visible country of consent by the Dnipro's lower paths. It ended not with the abolition of courage, but with its domestication. Andriy, bent now and careful with steps, watched the palisade pulled down and stacked into useful lengths. He touched a beam with his palm, and felt an old warmth traveling like an afterthought. He did not curse. He said a prayer with no request in it, only the names of brothers. And then he went to the river, because the river listens. What happens to a people when their house is dismantled? The same thing that happens to a story when the book is closed. It goes traveling. It moves into songs that outlive the men who first shaped them, into proverbs that slip into kitchens and markets, into icons where a saint's eyes look a little like an Ottoman's, into paintings where laughter is loud and shirts are bright, and the text being written is a reply to power. It enters the talk of children who do not yet know the dates and the stubbornness of grandfathers who remember them all. It becomes the way a rider sits a horse, the angle at which a man holds his head when he is told to obey, the reflex with which a community forms a circle when something needs deciding. By the time the 19th century polished its museums and planted its parks, the word Cossack had split in two. One half marching under imperial banners, sharp and loyal, the other half living in memory, a republic that no ukase can dissolve. In that republic, Andrei and his brothers never age past their prime. They row forever into a black sea that keeps its secrets. They vote forever under a sky that keeps its stars. They lift forever the mace that is not a weapon, but a symbol borrowed from their own hands. The actual boards of the Sich became someone's fence, someone's ladder, someone's firewood. The idea, oath, council, bread, became a legend that sits beside the actual fence and tells time by the river. On certain evenings, when the wind comes from the south and brings a salt thought with it, you can hear the old bell, though no bell hangs there now. It is only your own blood remembering how to count. You may never put a finger on a map and find the country they made. You do not need to. The cartography of such places is kept in voices and gestures and choices. Defeat put walls around the land. Memory removed the roof and left the sky. The story we have walked together has the shape of a river, sources hidden in marsh and memory, a quickening in youth, then breadth, then the long, patient reach toward an unseen sea. Along its banks, men built a republic out of oaths and open air. They were not saints. They were not monsters. They were people who discovered, through hard use, that freedom is less a flag than a discipline. You keep it the way you keep a fire, by tending, by sharing heat, by learning when to shield it from wind and when to feed it with more wind. The Cossacks understood that a vote in daylight is both a ceremony and a craft, that a promise spoken with smoke still in your hair can outlast a treaty stamped with 20 seals. That, brother, is a word that grows heavier the longer you carry it. Because they lived at an edge, they became a symbol for edges everywhere. Their enemies called them unruly. Their friends called them necessary. The river called them home. To the powerful, they were a reminder that consent has a language no army quite learns to translate. To the powerless, they were a rumor with muscle, men who could leave the brittle safety of obedience and still not fall through the world. That rumor crossed borders and centuries. It found new listeners in towns where people gather for school board votes, in coalitions that meet in church basements, in kitchen table campaigns, where the only mace is a wooden spoon and the only counsel is 3 raised hands. The point is not that a palisade can be rebuilt on a modern map. The point is that a habit can be relearned, to test power in the open, to give leadership on trust, and take it back without hatred when trust is spent, to measure a person by the work of their hands and not by the letters after their name. This is why the figure of the Cossack lingers even when the specific saddle and saber have gone to museums. He stands in the shared imagination for that stubborn alignment of spine and spirit which refuses the role of subject and insists on the older role of citizen. Citizen of a campfire, a town, a river valley, a future. Freedom in this telling is not loud. It is a composure, a way of answering insult with competence, pressure with presence, invitation with care. It is the refusal to mistake uniformity for unity. It is the knowledge that dignity begins where a person can say no, and means most where a person can say yes to the burdens that follow. Step closer to the long view, and you will see why this matters beyond one river's history. The desire that animated those councils, the desire to be accounted for, to be judged fairly, to carry one's share and not another man's chain, does not belong to a century or a shore. It is stitched into us as neatly as the seam in a shirt, not visible at first glance, but holding the whole together. Empires rise and fall. Economies rearrange their ledgers. Flags change their colors and their corners. And yet the ache for a life lived upright, for a vote that counts, for bread earned under a sky that does not feel like a ceiling, this ache is older than any border. It is the quiet drum in the chest of everyone who has ever paused at a doorway and wondered whether to step through. So the Cossack story, properly understood, is not an antique. It is a mirror held at dusk. In it, we catch ourselves, weary from work, still capable of listening, suspicious of pomp, invested in the small mercies that make neighbors of strangers. The chapel by the council yard may be gone, but candles are lit in other rooms. The mace that passed from hand to hand may rest behind glass, but authority continues to be lent and recalled in school gyms and union halls and online assemblies where faces glow with the same combination of hope and worry. The river has other names: Hudson, Columbia, Mississippi. But the lesson rides their waters as well. That a community is not the sum of its sharpest elbows, nor the length of its police tape, but the breadth of its shared patience and the precision of its shared refusals. What abides is not costume, but appetite. The human appetite for a life dignified by responsibility instead of supervised by suspicion. This appetite outlasts winters and decrees. It outlasts defeat. It is why memory refuses to vanish when palisades do. It is why stories are told in minor keys that leave room for thought. It is why children hear a ballad and do not understand the dates, and yet understand exactly what is being asked of them. The eternal is not elsewhere. It is present wherever a hand is raised in honest consent, wherever bread is divided without counting the slices twice, wherever a man or woman feels the rightness of standing up straight, and does so even if no one is watching. Now, let the tone soften. The Dnipro speaks more gently at night. The last gold leaks from the sky and finds the domes in the distance, where they catch it the way a good listener catches a thought, lightly, faithfully, without interruption. Their surfaces hold the day a moment longer, returning it as a tender shimmer, an answer to all that clattered and hurried below. In the reeds, the wind learns its evening work. It passes with the dry whisper of a hand over linen. Horses nicker and settle. Somewhere a spoon touches the rim of a pot and makes a round, silver sound. The bell that once gathered men to the yard is gone, but the ear insists it can still hear it. Not loud, not insistent, just a calm counting of hours, as if to say, yes, this came to pass, and yes, it matters, and yes, It is time to rest the tools. On the black water, stars draw their long, patient scratches. A boat's wake unwrites itself. If you kneel and reach your fingers to the current, the chill will find you, and with it, a recognition. This is the same water that moved under oars and under ice, that carried grain and rumor, that received the weight of bodies and the drift of flowers thrown from a chapel door. Rivers remember by going on. They gather what we give them, the names we shout and the names we whisper, and they carry those syllables to places where we cannot follow. It is enough to know they carry them. The steppe smells of time and dust. Grass takes the starlight and makes a small silver sea of it. In that sea, there are roots older than maps, carved by hooves and habit, and they lead toward every horizon at once. The wind rehearses the same old vows, speaking softly through stalk and seed head. Be ready, be kind, be brave when the world is small, and brave when it is too large. Keep your word, keep your brother. It is not a sermon, it is the weather, which has always been our first teacher and our last. If you listen, you will hear other textures of quiet. The soft rasp of wool across a bench, the thud of boots set neatly side by side, the faint click of a lock, checked and found smooth. You will hear a line from a song that no one quite remembers, beginning again anyway, steady as breath. You will hear, in the distance, a city turning down its lamps, the golden skins of its churches answering the dark with a promise that does not need a language. In that thinned light, you may think of a young man with a new name standing straight beside a fire, of an older man counting his dead without bitterness, of a circle of men, and then of men and women, lit by the same flame that has learned to travel. The river goes on. It holds its silence like a kindly secret. It moves with the dignity of something that has never needed to hurry. On its banks, once, a brotherhood learned how to make decisions in the open and stand by them in the dark. That knowledge has scattered the way embers scatter and find new tinder. You can mark its presence in the way a neighbor pauses before speaking harshly, in the way a community meets to argue and leaves with a plan, in the way a hand rests on a shoulder long enough to transfer steadiness, but not so long as to presume. You can mark it in your own chest when you feel a small door open there, and you choose the honest path, even though no one will give you a medal for it. What remains of the Cossacks is not only a chapter, but a climate, a reliable, breathable air that travels wherever people decide to divide bread fairly and keep faith under pressure. It gathers around river mouths and around dinner tables, in naval yards and in small offices where someone refuses to forge a signature. It is old, and it is new whenever someone takes responsibility without waiting to be asked. It wears armor when necessary, and aprons when necessary, and spends most of its time wearing neither. So let the evening be what it is meant to be, a widening gentleness. The Dnipro carries the day away with a sound like remembering. The domes keep their soft answer a moment longer, and then dim, content. The steppe exhale reaches the water, and then the stones, and then your own pulse. In that hush, picture the council fire not as an artifact, but as a shape the night still knows how to make. A circle of faces, a center of warmth. Words wait until they fall true. No commands, only invitations to steadiness, to care, to a way of being free that does not need shouting. The water turns in its bed and goes on. You stand and go with it a little way. Then you stop. The river has work to do. So do you. Between you moves the oldest agreement in the world: to keep faith, to carry one another when needed, to let the past guide without chaining the future, to let the wind write its brief, honest script across the grass and the skin and the mind. When the night deepens, it does so kindly. The last thing you see is the faint ribbon of light along the domes and the flat shine on the current. The last thing you hear is the steppes' patient whisper. And what you feel, calm, settled, steady, is not nostalgia. It is recognition. He appears again where we first met him, at the edge of water. The years have trimmed him down to essentials: sinew, habit, a way of standing that keeps one foot half turned toward the river. Andriy has learned how to carry both loss and plenty without noise. He knows which knots hold in rain, which silences mend faster than words. His forelock has thinned, but the gesture of his hand, steadying a gunwale, smoothing a horse's neck, passing bread, remains the signature of a man who chose his life and kept choosing it. He watches the current. Once it was a road and a shield. Now, toward the end of his walking, it is a companion. He listens to its unhurried counsel and thinks of the distances crossed since that first morning when frost made the fields crackle, and a single hard word from his father contained both blessing and apology. He thinks of faces gathered and scattered, of a chapel bell that counted victories and funerals with the same calm, of a mace lifted and set down with tenderness, because the hand that lifts it is always borrowed. And then the scene folds outward until it touches us. Perhaps your grandmother kept a gray photograph in a drawer, men with shaved heads and alarming mustaches, laughing into the wind. Perhaps there is a last name in your family that people mispronounce, and you keep correcting gently, as if caring for a small, stubborn flame. Maybe a tune turns up at a wedding or a street festival, and you find your foot marking time before your mind explains why. The Brotherhood's country is gone from maps, but not from behaviors. Neighbors gathering to decide something with their hands raised. A community welcoming back its own, scuffed but not shamed. A child recognizing exactly what courage is before knowing the word for it. The signs are ordinary. A bandura's slow river of notes in a church hall. An old man in Philadelphia unpacking a story and setting it carefully on a paper plate beside a slice of honey cake. A woman in Chicago lighting a candle on a winter night and teaching a phrase that tastes of smoke and kindness. A street in New York named for a saint whose icon's eyes look out with the same amused severity as a long-ago Ataman. A reenactor's boots, yes, but also a school board meeting's patience, a union vote counted in daylight, a promise kept when no one is watching. These are the places where the palisade quietly reappears, not as walls, but as a circle around a shared fire. Andriy does not step toward us. He does not need to. It is enough that he is there, as steadfast as a post driven into good ground, as provisional as a tent that can be struck in 10 careful minutes. He tilts his head at a pair of swallows mapping loops over the water. He smiles without showing teeth. If you stood beside him, he would not offer a speech. He might point at the ripple where two currents meet and say, "There." You would look, and you would see the seam, soft, precise, where different waters agree to travel together without losing themselves. Evening gathers. The domes upriver hold a shawl of late light and then let it go. On the far bank, grass leans and straightens with a sound like linen folded and refolded. A skiff noses along, leaving a wake that writes and unwrites the day. Somewhere a song begins, the kind that knows its way in the dark. It does not ask you to sleep. It asks only this: tend your fire, share your bread, lend and recall authority with care. Keep your brother, keep your word, keep your horizon. The river turns once more and moves on. We stand where the bank is firm and watch it work. Nothing in it hurries. Nothing in it stops. Andrei sets his palm on the warm plank of a boat, the same gesture he made when he first crossed into a life chosen in full light. He looks at the water as if reading an old friend's face, and satisfied, he lets the moment close. The rest is ours to carry, quietly, competently, without theater. The past does not vanish. It floats quietly beside us, like a still river,